a lot of filibustering. So anyway, welcome everybody to this class, Arthur Miller's American Century. As I said, my name is Kieran Leinster, and this is going to be 8 classes from September to November this year at 7 to 9 o'clock in person in Belfield. The exact room has obviously not been decided yet, but we will let you know when it is. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to talk about today for the next hour or so, I'm going to give some of the background on Arthur Miller, who is going to be well known to some of you. Some of you have probably read or seen at least a couple of his plays, but there's also some things I think that are slightly less well known about Miller that I think are really interesting and that I want to focus on. I'm also going to talk about the reading list. This is going to be, because this is 8 classes, it will be a play a week. So in the first class on the 22nd, I expect people will, oh, sorry, that's a mistake. That should be Thursday, the 22nd of September. So for the first class, I expect people to have read the first play, and for the second class, the second play, and so forth. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I want to do in the class, how I kind of want to get you, if you have an idea of Miller and his life and his career, how I want to broaden that a little bit and deepen it as well. I also want to talk about the themes that are prevalent in Miller's work and how these themes might change from his early plays that we all know, like Death of a Salesman and The Crucible, to some of the later, slightly odder plays that are really never performed, especially in this part of the world. And then, as I say, there will be time for questions at the end. So, Arthur Miller, and this is, you know, this is not crucial stuff, but it's just some of the important points of his life. He was born in 1915 in New York City. His father lost a huge amount of money in the crash. They were quite wealthy. They lived on on Central Park, and they moved out to Brooklyn. Miller, who was pretty lousy in school in 1934, joined the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he studied journalism, later changing to English and doing several playwriting classes under a very influential professor, Kenneth Rowe. 1940, he marries his first wife, Mary Slattery, who obviously from an Irish background, she was a committed Marxist, a rather not as glamorous perhaps as some of his later wives, and their marriage didn't last very long after Miller became successful, which is of course a depressingly common theme in writers' works. In 1944, he had his first Broadway play, which closed after 4 performances, called The Man Who Had All the Luck. And in 1947, in his last effort to be a playwright, he produced All My Sons, which was extremely successful. He said it won all these awards. And it was also his first collaboration with the director, Elia Kazan, who I'll be coming back to a little bit today, but a lot throughout the course. He was a theater director, film director. You've probably seen some of his works. Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, Facing the Crowd. He worked with Miller a lot, and I think I'd make the argument that he's the most important person in Miller's life, and I will definitely justify that. Well, I'll try to justify that throughout. So Miller then entered his sort of most famous, most successful period with Death of a Salesman, The Crucible, 1953. 1956, he famously testifies in front of the House Committee on Un-American Activities and marries Marilyn Monroe. And even there's a lot of legend around this appearance at the committee, the impact of the committee, the reason for him being called in front of the committee. And that's all going to come up in the class, because Miller is kind of often, or certainly was often, lauded as this secular saint who, you know, alone stood up to McCarthy. And that's not really what happened. So I'll be talking about, say, the testimony of the likes of Paul Robeson, the actor, playwright Lillian Hellman, who were much sterner, I would say, in the face of HUAC than Miller. In 1961, we have his first film, The Misfits, which we can't really put on the course, which is a shame. But if anyone has seen this, you will know what a bizarre film it is. And the story behind the making of that film is absolutely tragic, but really, really fascinating. You've got people like Miller, Monroe, John Huston directing, Clark Gable, Eli Wallach, Montgomery Clift, Thelma Ritter, all getting drunk in Reno, Nevada in the heat for months on end. It's fascinating. Also in that year that film is released, he divorces from Marilyn Monroe. The following year she dies and he marries a photographer, Inga Marat. Soon after, he releases two new plays at the Lincoln Center in New York City, which is one of the most important attempts to have a publicly funded theater in America. And this brings him back into collaboration with Elia Kazan, who's a very friendly witness in front of the Committee on Un-American Activities, which causes a big rift in their friendship. And one of the plays here, After the Fall, directed by Kazan, deals very, very heavily with Miller's personal life, with Monroe, with the committee, with Kazan himself. And again, that's another, it's not a fantastic, well, it didn't get fantastically well reviewed, but it's really, really fascinating. The story of that production, and well, I think lots of things about it are fascinating, and we'll get into that for sure. And then as Miller got a little bit older, he certainly got less, he got far less praise with his plays. After The Price in 1968, he was really sort of relegated from the big leagues of American drama, but he also had other things going on. From 1965, he was the president of Penn International. He began to travel widely through the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Spain, Asia. His wife, Marat, was a photographer, and she was a great learner of languages. So they traveled all over the world. Really interestingly, he was a delegate from Connecticut at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where there was a huge amount of violence unleashed by police at the mayor's order on protesters against the Vietnam War. Real seminal moment in American history. And then we see plays such as The Archbishop's Ceiling. And then towards the late 80s, he publishes his autobiography, Time Bends, which is really, it's a great book. It got a lot of praise, but there's certainly things that he does not allow. He speaks quite frankly about his relationship with Monroe, with the filming of The Misfits. They're really, really fantastic pieces. But there's certainly things that he guards against revealing. And what's really fascinating is that in the following year, Kazan publishes his biography. And the men didn't have much of a relationship at this time, but there's a lot in Kazan's book that Miller doesn't give us. So I like comparing those two. Into the 90s, Miller kind of becomes this wise old head, I suppose, of American drama. Again, not really lauded or respected a huge amount in his own country, but becomes far more well respected in the UK, thanks to directors like David Thacker, who produced a huge amount of his work in the West End, the Old Vic. In 1994, we have Broken Glass winning the Olivier Award for Best Play. Not a film, a play I adore, but a lot of people do. In 1996, there's a film of The Crucible, which is produced. He gets a nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay. 2002, his third wife dies, and the play Resurrection Blues is performed. This is, I think, a really, really brilliant play. It's very different to anything else he had written before. It's very funny, it's very bleak, it's very dark. Had several disastrous performances, or productions, I should say, excuse me, which is probably one of the reasons why it's almost disappeared from American theater, or it disappeared as soon as it arrived. But I love it, and I think if it was written by someone of half the age and a quarter of the status, it would now be a really significant play. Alas, it's not. And in February 2005, Miller died aged 89, with a pretty extraordinary career behind him. 60 years on the American stage is, as far as I know, unmatched and probably unmatchable. And that's what I think is really fascinating about Miller and his life and his career, that you can see, you can track American culture, American society, American writing from his first Broadway play in 1944 to, well, his second last play in 2002, because it's better than Finishing the Picture. But Finishing the Picture, his last play, is also really interesting and was performed recently in London for the first time. So this is the reading list. And again, don't worry too much about this. I can, if anybody wants, this is being recorded. And if anybody wants me to, I can send the slides. So this just to kind of, I'll speak a little bit about each of these plays. All My Sons was Miller's, as I said, first hit, very influenced by sort of realistic, quote unquote, drama of the likes of Henrik Ibsen, the American dramatist Clifford Odets, who was very, very popular in the 1930s, but for several reasons that, again, I'll discuss because I think they're pretty interesting, faded quite quickly. It's a very, in a way, this kind of forged Miller's, the conception of Miller is this straight, narrow, realist playwright, when in fact that's not the case. 2 years later, and for week 2 of our class, Death of a Salesman, which was very, very well known. It gets performed in colleges and regional theaters almost every day, very regularly, big productions of it. First one starred Lee J. Cobb, the sort of great burly actor who actually played it in a very different way to how Miller envisioned the role, but despite this, defined the role then for the future. And both of these were directed by Kazan. Kazan, who at the same time was directing the early work of Tennessee Williams, such as Streetcar Named Desire, and winning Oscars for films such as Gentleman's Agreement. So he was a really, really interesting artistic figure at this time, and he'll reappear. So in week 3, I want to go back a little bit to The Man Who Had All the Luck, which, as I said, was Miller's first play, very badly, and it was only published in, I believe, the 1980s, actually. It's slightly harder to find, but certainly not impossible. And what I think is really worthwhile about going back to this play after the first 2 quite well-known plays is that once we're familiar with those plays, we can go back and see the genesis of so much in The Man Who Had All the Luck. It's 2 brothers. It's a lot about fate. It's a lot about justice. It's a lot about difficult family relationships. So yeah, this is something that most people, I mean, we very, very rarely get a chance to see this play. I saw a reading of it at the Abbey about 8 years ago. So I really like to highlight this play because it's very difficult to find. Then we're going to talk about The Crucible, his famous McCarthyism allegory set in Salem in the end of the 17th century. But even with this, I want to kind of complicate it, because I think sometimes if you really, if you know what a play is about, quote unquote, when you go into it, that's all you see. So I want to loosen that perception a little bit. I want to see what else is there, because there's a huge amount in The Crucible that pertains very closely to Miller's personal life. I think it was 1952. He divorced his first wife and began his relationship with Monroe. Then we're going to jump forward a little bit to After the Fall. Very, very, well, I don't want to say too much about this play, but very controversial, very interesting, very divisive. Again, directed by Kazan with Jason Robards, the great actor of the plays of Eugene O'Neill, in the lead role. Barbara Loden was the lead actress who later became Kazan's second wife. And again, there's just so many great backstories around this that makes it a disastrous production. But I think a really fascinating work. I'm so interested to see what people who don't have all the biographical information on the play think of it. Then again, it's a little bit of a jump to The Archbishop's Ceiling, which was published in 1984, but first performed in 1977. So it's a real 1970s play. And I think when you read it, you can see that. because it's a lot of it, it's about paranoia, it's about surveillance, it's this perfect Watergate era play. But people kind of dismiss it. It was set set in effectively Prague, and the whole question revolves around, is the government listening in, and what that does to these writers who gather in this room. Both, excuse me, both writers who resist and comply with the current regime. And I think you can see a lot of Miller in here. You could see a lot of, again, Kazan. You could also see a lot of Miller's friend, Václav Havel, who was the Czech dissident at the time, dissident and playwright at the time, then later became president of the new Czech Republic. Then for the second last week, we're going to talk about The Ride Down Mount Morgan, which was first published in 1991. There are slightly different versions, but it doesn't really matter. I don't care which one you get, and it won't change it a huge amount. And this is notable for, again, being, I think, really funny and really fantastic. I love this play, but it was the first Miller play to debut, first new Miller play to debut outside of the USA. And this reflects his diminished status there and also growing status in the UK. And then the final play, which is going to have, which has a little typo, Resurrection Blues, comes from 2002, not 2004, but it is published in Collected Plays 6. This is a great satire, black comedy. I don't know exactly what you'd call it, but there's so much here, and it's not what you would expect to find of this august playwright in his latter years. So that's just a little idea of what we're going to be reading and why. There's loads more I could have included. I will also probably be making some essays that he wrote available. I'll scan those and send them to you, that I think will just sort of ballast what we have here. So finding the plays could be difficult. Obviously, Death of a Salesman and The Crucible, All My Sons, will be easier, but the later ones will be much tougher. So I would say plan ahead if you're interested. I'll be able to share, I've got a couple of copies of maybe half of them, but for the later ones like Resurrection Blues and Ride Down Mount Morgan, I just have the one, so there's not much I can do there, unfortunately. Obviously, your local library, you never know. I mean, it's free to join, so why wouldn't you? But you could end up finding a copy. I think I found a copy of a few of these down here in Dunleary. Then chapters and books upstairs are pretty good for plays, but also two bookshops that you might not be as familiar with, but have really good play selections. Marrowbone Books in the Coombe and The Last Bookshop in Camden Street. That's just an idea of where to find them. And Marrowbone is great actually for, especially American fiction in particular. So I'd really recommend going there. So I also use this phrase, the Arthur Miller's American Century, in this class. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about what this means. And this comes from a relatively short article, 12, 13 pages, by the publisher Henry Luce from February 1941, at a time before America was officially involved in the Second World War, but was, as he is, very much involved. Excuse me. And I think what's interesting about this is, well, I mean, first of all, the reason I select this is because it sets this case out that from February 1941, the next 60 years will be the American century. This is when America is going to dominate politically, socially, economically, culturally, militarily, the world. And what I think, a lot of this lays down the foundations for mass American interventionism in things like the Vietnam attempt at liberating themselves from French imperialism in the 1950s that leads to the Vietnam War, and to interventions in the Middle East, in South America, and I would, argue still now into the 21st century. I think it's just interesting to look at some of the phrases that Luce uses. We are in a war to defend and even to promote, encourage, and incite so-called democratic principles throughout the world. And this is stuff that we can still see happening now, despite the sort of many of the radically anti-democratic things about America. especially at this time in relation to African Americans and women. But he's right when he says that no man can say that the picture of America as an impregnable armed camp is false. And he says, look, we are this giant standing army that can't be invaded or beaten in war. So we have to show that, we have to express that. And it's very interesting that this is kind of set against a lot of the hyper defensiveness that characterized the early years of the Cold War, the sense that the Russians are coming at any moment, whereas Luce is correct here. Luce is effectively saying they're not coming or nobody's coming, but even still we should go out and dominate the globe. Of course, he sees in the midst of the Battle of Britain that Great Britain is very happy for the USA to take over their role as leader of the world. And if you look at this, this is very sort of, it's very religious, his way of speaking about American exceptionalism. He says that the goal is to accept wholeheartedly our duty and our opportunity as the most powerful and vital nation in the world, and in consequence to exert upon the world the full impact of our influence for such purposes as we see fit and by such means as we see fit. So, you know, you can, and this is what happened. You can see a lot of this subsequently happened. So what I'm interested in is how Miller reacts to this world that Luce describes, and really to an extent does come into being. Someone who's just turned on a speaker, and I don't know who, but that's all right. If you can mute it, that would be great, but don't worry about it. And this is, I'm not going to kind of dwell too much on this, but it's really interesting piece of writing that, as I said, is worth looking at, and I'll provide a link to it at the end. And as Luce says, if it is to come to life in any nobility of health and vigor, the 20th century must be to a significant degree an American century. American prestige throughout the world is faith in the good institutions, as well as in the ultimate intelligence and ultimate strength of the whole American people. We have lost some of that prestige in the last few years, but most of it is still there. I think the echoes of that you can see in the next 80 years plus. Is really, really interesting to see where they've come from and where they are now. And again, this is just sort of some hyper-American, very, as I said, religious rhetoric that Miller actually, to be honest, in some strange ways, and I'll talk about this, does indulge in a little bit himself, especially as a younger man in his 30s and 40s. But he very much glides out of that as he gets older, which again, I will refer to throughout. So these are kind of the core themes in Miller's work that I want to talk about. Debt, justice, morality. You can kind of see similar ideas, that the idea that there's some people who owe someone else, some people who need to be punished, some people who are not good. And so who is good? And is good being different from being innocent? So if we think about Death of a Salesman, say, you know, is Willy Loman good? Well, he's not a great guy, but he just has the wrong goals is the problem. He doesn't really do a whole lot of damage to sort of people outside of his family, but the damage he does to his family spring from his inherent flaws. And what power do we have over those flaws? Miller is asking. In All My Sons, Joe Keller doesn't realize that he has a debt to people outside of his family. And the son, Chris, he sees that. He says, no, you do. There is something bigger than family. History, what can we learn from the past? Do we learn the right lessons? I mean, The Crucible is a great example of this, but it will come through in other plays. And then later, kind of these questions get a little bit more esoteric. How do we know what we truly think, feel, or know? Are we responsible for our own destruction? Do we cause the bad things in our lives to happen, but decide that it's easier to not admit it? And really, I think the question in Resurrection Blues, its penultimate play, is is life so awful that we should just laugh at it? And, you know, I think it's a question that still has a lot of relevance. So, and this is kind of where I want to talk a bit more about the Miller that isn't as well known. The three things we all know about Arthur Miller: he wrote Death of a Salesman, he married Marilyn Monroe, and he testified in front of HUAC. But then I want to talk about things like the influence of Clifford Odets in the group theater. Very, very important person, very important group in American theater history. Elia Kazan, great director. I don't think anyone else has ever conquered Broadway and Hollywood in the way he did. Very controversial man, very, very interesting novelist, director, clear influence, I argue, on Miller's plays repeatedly. And I'm going to show that. And he worked with all of the great actors, from Brando to Robert De Niro to Faye Dunaway, Kirk Douglas, Carl Malden, very repeatedly, Lee J. Cobb, of course. So there's a whole lot to get into with Kazan. Miller and the Lincoln Center, as I said, this attempt at public theater which went terribly wrong. Miller's the essayist, wrote dozens of essays, possibly hundreds, maybe, I don't know, throughout his career. So we're going to look at some of those. The screenwriter for The Misfits, for The Crucible, controversial TV film, Playing for Time, where the Jewish prisoner Fania Fenelon was played by critic of Israel, Vanessa Redgrave, and the problems that caused the pair of them. Miller the activist, his work with Penn, his protesting against the Vietnam War, his presence at 2 Democratic conventions as a delegate from Connecticut, 68 and 72, his trip to Turkey with Harold Pinter, where they got thrown out of the American ambassador's house. Peter Riley was a young man who lived near Miller in Connecticut, was beaten into confessing to the murder of his mother and her lover. Miller took the case and publicized it and put his financial and moral backing behind it. Really, really interesting. It comes into his plays a little bit, maybe not so much in the plays we're talking about, but really interesting stuff. Miller the statesman, and that's kind of, you could put it in quotes almost. He had this bizarre meeting with North Vietnamese representatives in Paris, 1968. He interviewed Nelson Mandela for the BBC. He had audiences in Havana and Moscow, I believe, I suppose, with Fidel Castro and Mikhail Gorbachev. It's just, there's so much that's really, really fascinating that is beyond these Salesman, Monroe, and HUAC incidents. But also with, and this kind of comes into my own research, the importance of Miller's later plays and what happened in his later life. After 1968, Miller largely disappears, and I want to look at why and how, and the what we lost, or what was lost, by ignoring Miller. There's a famous story he told of going to rent a car at an airport, and when he showed his ID to the young woman who worked there, she said, "Oh wow, that's just like the writer." And he said, yeah, that's me. And she said, "No, you can't be him. He's dead." Now, if it's happened or not, I think it's revealing that he told that story. And we've also got to contrast this with, got to look at how Miller was regarded in the UK versus in the US, his home. The director David Thacker famously said that in England, people regarded Miller as slightly above God, but also slightly below Shakespeare. Whereas James Walcott, the literary critic, described Miller upon reading his autobiography as the honest Abe Lincoln of American letters, ministering from his marble throne to the ailing soul of the Republic. And I want to kind of maybe think about what is it about Miller that rubs up all these American critics the wrong way, and what is it about America and American critics that get rubbed up the wrong way by Miller, because I think that's really interesting. And I know I'm annoyed this picture has the Getty Images logo, but it's, if you're looking for a Lincoln-esque picture, then, well, there it is. So these later plays, and this is just little snippets to throw out to entice you. because he adopts new languages, styles, themes, interests. But critics and scholars, even the Miller scholars, will often just compare them to Salesman, Crucible, View from the Bridge, All My Sons, which I don't think is very interesting. I think it's more interesting to look at these plays as they are, where they come from, and what they might be doing that he doesn't do in his early plays. So, for instance, The Archbishop's Ceiling, which he wrote in the 70s, is a great paranoia play. And in the 1970s, you have all these wonderful paranoia films that I'm sure some of you have seen: Chinatown, The Conversation, Taxi Driver, All the President's Men, The Parallax View, Clute, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I mean, these are just some of the greatest films ever made. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Miller is writing paranoia work that centers on surveillance at the same time that these people are. Also around this time, he wrote that, or sorry, towards the end of the 80s, he wrote that the 70s were an unheroic time. And you can see the exact same sentiment expressed in a really sleazy, nasty, cheap B-movie from the late 70s called Assault on Precinct 13 that Miller absolutely never saw. So I think it's interesting that you have these sleazy, low-budget movies and the most famous play in the country expressing the same idea. That's not a coincidence to me. And if you look at then The Ride Down Mount Morgan, some people interpret as a critique of this 1980s greed and excess, like Wall Street, The Bonfire of the Vanities, really great works. So I want to both look at it in those terms, but also see what else is there. Resurrection Blues, it's about reality TV, it's about media saturation. It does comedic things that go back to Chaplin's The Great Dictator, but also use similar things that we see in the Austin Powers franchise. And again, if anyone has seen Network by Palichayevsky, which is a really stunning film, you're going to see things that you recognize in Resurrection Blues. So I think a lot of these critics don't take the opportunity to place Miller in his time, which is what I'm going to try to do for us here. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm just going to take it. So if we think about Miller today, or this is really Miller in the last decade or so, it's not like he's disappeared. And this is in many ways, both in old work being revisited, both in his work being used or changed, and in depictions of Miller himself. So in 2011, you had the Eddie Redmayne film, My Week with Marilyn, where Miller, newly married to Monroe, was played by Dougray Scott. In 2014, Ivo Van Hove's A View from the Bridge was at the Young Vic and the West End. This is sort of won stunning number of awards and plaudits. It went to New York. People still talk about it now. In 2015, his disused screenplay, The Hook, which he was working on with Kazan in the early 1950s, it never got produced, partly because Miller didn't know how films worked, partly because it maybe wasn't very good, and partly because the politics could have been dicey. It was about union corruption, or that's not true, excuse me. It was about workers standing up to corruption on the Red Hook dockfront in New York. Some people say it influenced Kazan's On the Waterfront, written by Bud Schulberg. It didn't, and it's provable that it didn't. It just so happened that they had similar themes. But in 2015, this was adapted for the stage, and for some reason had its premiere in Northampton. You also had then his college play, No Villain, at the Old Red Lion in London, which transferred to Trafalgar Studios the following year. 2016, the Iranian film, The Salesman, which is about an actor couple in Iran who are playing the lead roles in Death of the Salesman and the issues in their marriage and how they mirror. Then in 2018 in Dublin, and this was really exciting, Annie Ryan, the director, adapted Miller's film, The Misfits, for the stage. And and it was really impressive. I liked it a lot. Also that year, the documentary Arthur Miller Writer was released, which is really, really good. I'd recommend it to anybody to kind of color any of the blanks. And then just this year, a really fantastic play was performed at the Writers Theatre in Chicago. Eleanor Burgess's Wife of a Salesman, which she describes the death of a salesman with all the men taken out. It kind of imagines a reality in which Willie Loman's wife goes and confronts his mistress and what that might have looked like. It's a great, great play. And also, the end of September, Joyce Carol Oates' epic novel about the life of Monroe, Blonde, will be released on Netflix, where Miller will be played by Adrian Brody, which is interesting because Brody is this sort of very angular, very slim, very tall man. And sometimes he's a good pick for Miller, but Miller was much broader. He was a big man, which kind of belies some of the stereotypes around Miller. I think he's thought of as a sort of scholarly, thin, reedy man, but he was not. He was a football player at school. He was a farmer. He planted hundreds of trees at his home in Connecticut, and he was pretty bad in school. So this is he was really most at home on his tractor, on his farm. And so that's kind of pretty much all from me. This is just some suggested readings, the Luce article in the American Century, the interview with Greenfield in the Times in '72, I really liked, because it's kind of Miller when he's kind of making the transition from extremely well-known writer to yesterday's news, to be very mean about it. Roy Hattersley meets Arthur Miller in October 1998. That's a really, really good overview. It's in The Guardian. It's free. And then this Chris Weekend article on The Salesman, the Iranian film from last year, is really worth looking at. So that's really all from me. Just to kind of recap, this is going to be Thursday, the 22nd of September to Thursday, the 10th of November, 7 to 9 o'clock, in-person classes, and it's going to be held in person in Belfield.